Part of that, man. Thanks.
My pleasure. Of
Okay.
course.
Awesome. All right. Let me do the formal intro and then we will get going. Hi, everyone. Anthony Fantano here, Internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And it's time for an exclusive interview and conversation with an artist we've had on as a guest before. We've been doing interviews so long that we're like, bringing people back on, which I feel like we had to, given how great your latest LP was, because the last time we had a conversation with you, it was after your debut. Your new LP, Struggler, is out now and is one of my favorite albums of the year. So, of course, I wanted to bring you on, pick your brain about the record, and just kind of get more of a deeper meaning behind the album from you directly, because just like your last LP, this one is kind of conceptual too.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you for having me. First and foremost, the sequel, be back.
Mm-hmm.
Round two, fight night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Pick my brain. Pick my now bald brain.
I feel like I want to start this off by saying that it's not even a question, just more of a statement. It's more of it's more of a recollection of our last interview, and it actually is one of my favorite interview moments of all the conversations that we've had on this channel and on the Fantano channel, again, of all of them. And that's when I asked you, like, why did you do like a concept album out of the gate? Like, you responded instantaneously and just said, because other artists are pussy. You said other artists pussy.
Yeah.
And I'm just glad to see that you're being consistent with that feeling on this new LP, and trying to get a narrative across. That's the first thing I'll say. Again, not even a question.
Thank you.
So
And I stand by it.
okay, good.
Other artist pussy.
Okay, good. So I wanted to follow that up and say, or ask, when did this album start to conceptualize for you? Like, when did the story behind it and the way it was going to sound start to come together and really, become clear in your mind?
It's kind of hard to like pinpoint the exact moments. The creation process was a lot less linear than the Smiling with No Teeth one was. Like that was created in like COVID times. We had nothing else to do, so it was kind of like I know when it started, when it ended.
Mm.
Whereas this one was off the back of touring that album. So like instead of having this mad abundance of time, I kind of had to search for time to create, which I'm sure is the general experience of most musicians. But it was a new challenge for me. But I think honestly, most of the album came together in the months of like October 22 and January 23. So pretty recent. Yeah, I think that's when things started to really come together.
You talk about the way you've been having to balance different obligations and pressures more now that I guess you have a bigger audience now, and I imagine at this point you're doing what you're doing professionally. How do you feel like you are, handling that increase in kind of like obligations and expectations?
I think it's like there are a lot of different kinds of pressures, and obviously there's like external pressures and standards, a lot more eyes on me. But I think the thing that I have to keep in mind and I guess battle with the most are the internal pressures, in which like I started making music from a very, I guess, pure standpoint. It was like a tool for therapy for me.
Hmm.
So it's very hard for me to just view music as like a product. Now that it's a career for me, like I do have to come through with some sort of, consistency in how I drop music and the amount of times that I drop music, so I can, put food on the table. But it's with that, like I have to make sure it stays authentic and genuine, and I have something that I actually want to say, rather than just like making music for the sake of making music. I think that's the thing that I box with the most right now.
And do you feel like that you've had to make any sort of like creative compromises in order to, continue like growing the amount of ears or, people who are checking out your stuff or get it the exposure that you feel like it needs in order to, continue like doing this full time?
I think there's been pressure too, but I don't think it's actually come about. Like I had a very candid conversation with my manager when I was starting the second album, and we were talking about it, and we're like, yeah, Smiling with No Teeth did great, critically, lots of accolades, but like you're at a time in your life you need money, you need to live, like we need to start really thinking about what we can do to like actually put food on your table. Maybe we need to make some hits with this album. So I'm like, yeah, I went into it with that in mind, and then I came out with an album about a fucking roach that runs and runs and runs, trying not to get stepped on by God. So it kind of went in the complete opposite direction when I tried to like make those kinds of modifications. So yeah, the pressures have definitely been there to do it, but yeah, it's not in my DNA. But
Well,
we're still figuring it out.
well, it's not like there has been a complete shortage of interesting crossovers because, you did do that series of like, opening tour dates for Paramore. Like, how exactly did that come about? And how do you feel like, I mean, obviously they're a band that's like grown and changed a lot over the years. And I feel like this has kind of like coincided in an interesting way where, your latest album is kind of influenced by post-punk, as is their latest album, maybe like different strains and vibes within the genre, but like, still like there is like maybe a little bit of a similarity there in terms of like that making sense, but you're still being exposed to an audience that, many of whom may be sort of coming from more of like the pop punk world, and are seeing and hearing you for the first time. Some of whom I've heard from personally have been like, I didn't know who the hell this guy was. And I was kind of blown away by like the stage show and everything else that he had going on in the costumes. Like, how do you feel like you were received by an audience that potentially had like no basis for who you were or even what the hell you were doing?
Mm. Um, yeah, I think that tour was incredible. Shout out to Paramore, shout out to Block Party. Um, you asked how it came about. Shout out to Elkie. I'm so sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, but she is a musician and she's also the uh, drummer, Zach Farrow, the drummer from Paramore's partner. And I'm pretty sure she put him onto my music, who then put the rest of the band on.
Mm,
And that's how I got the slot. So shout out to all of them.
mm,
Beautiful, beautiful people. It's not my first time being an opener. It's probably one of my first times being an opener to that scale.
right.
But I think the challenge of being an opener is exactly that. It's a challenge that I'm like so willing and excited to take on head first. I think for a lot of people, concert goers, I feel like the opener can kind of just feel like filler between when they walk through the door and the time they get to see who they actually came for.
Right.
But like me knowing that, it's like my absolute mission to like grab your attention, grab your head, rip it off your body, make it mine, and like make sure you never forget this experience. And like the next time I'm in your city, you're going to be just as excited to see me as you were to see Paramore or Block Party. I think there's such a cool, especially like the first few songs versus the last few songs when I go on stage as an opener. There's like an immediate like what the fuck is going on when I first get on stage. For the last year I've been doing this thing where I'm like on the shoulders of my friends, these backup dancers, and in a large cloak, and it's quite like demorphed and absurd. But then through the set, it's we play the funk, we play the jams, we play the bangers, and by the end everyone's like, wow, yeah, this is the best shit ever. And I love seeing that roller coaster of emotions in the crowd, from like absolute disgust until eventual acceptance of what's going on.
Mm.
And, you know, whether they love it or they hate it, my mission is to make sure that they remember it.
Mm. And so, I mean, you know, any sort of other takeaways from, you know, I guess like opening for a band that kind of gave you that level of exposure? Do you feel like that has kind of like translated into maybe more anticipation for this record?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely saw, like, on like my music videos and on my socials and stuff like that, people being like, yeah, the same as you. Like, I'd never heard of this guy before, but you know, blew me away. Or, you know, the opposite. Like, I saw this comment, it was like, um, this my local radio station plays this song like every day. And usually when I see the start of that, it's like my local radio station plays this song every day, and I love it so much I had to find it. But this comment was like, my local radio station plays this song every day and I hate it. I just came to tell you that. And I loved that comment. I
So someone had
loved
to come
that.
out of
Like,
nowhere to
someone had
remind.
to
Yeah.
like, yeah, leaving the light
Right.
had such a like profound.
And this is an Australian station, I imagine, right?
No, I think
No?
it was a like college radio
Oh,
station
okay. Okay.
in America or something
All
like
right.
that. But I just love, like, um I just love being able to make people feel a way, in a strong sense, whether that's like positive or negative.
Yeah, you get
But
like a
anyway,
fuzzy feeling knowing that your song is torturing someone every day.
yeah. It's like the soundtrack to your hellscape. I love that.
I mean, the album is kind of hellish, so I mean, you are kind of like manifesting that in real life for somebody,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. We all roaches.
Right. All right. I wanted to ask you before we get into maybe some of the topics on the record. I wanted to know the significance of the album art, and obviously like the stripe down the middle, kind of like the separating line. And, you know, I mean, maybe this also plays into the hairdo too. You know, I want to know about, you know, what that kind of speaks to on the record. I mean, I have a hunch, but I could probably be totally wrong, you know, but I would like to know from you.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to answer, but, you know, for you, anything.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So the themes of the album are very much inspired by a philosophy of absurdism, which I guess, in summary, is like a philosophy that kind of notices humanity's like tendency to try and find meaning and law and order in life and in the world. But it recognizes that that is kind of like a torturous and kind of futile practice in a world that is so chaotic and absurd. And it kind of poses the thought that maybe, you know, you looking for meaning in this world that we're in is unnecessary, and like the grandeur and the joy and the wonder of the world is that we're literally here, like, against all odds, we're here and we're living on this planet that's like, we have this sun that provides us heat, but is just far enough away that we're not like burning to death. You know, we get to see the moon rise and fall every day. It's like a wondrous, miraculous thing that we're able to live through every day. And that should be your focus, I guess. So it's kind of like a philosophy that kind of casts aside the importance of needing a meaning and just asks you to live. So with that being said, I had a lot of ideas for the album. I tossed around with a friend of mine, Adi, who's a graphic designer. And we had a lot of options. Some were very cinematic, some were, you know, they were quite grand and big, but I feel like when I saw this, it kind of just felt right in that, you know, that line and those two strokes of two tones of red could mean different things. They could mean like the mark of the roach versus the grand, ever looming presence of that god character that takes up most of the frame. It could be the two reds could represent that. The red outside of the line could represent hell. It could represent earth. It could represent so many things, or it could just mean nothing. It could just mean absolutely nothing. It could just be a red screen with a line in the middle. And when I saw that, I think it just felt right. It spoke to the philosophy that made up the basis of the album. Yeah, it just felt like the album to me, and it wasn't really trying to impress. It just was what it was. So yeah.
I mean, as I was kind of reading into what the album and kind of what the progression of it says, and how it kind of displays that a lot of the struggle that the main character has against God and so on and so forth throughout the record ends up kind of being something that almost like they themselves are cooking up in their own mind. You know, to me, it felt like the two reds were like the same thing the entire time. You know, it's like the battle in your mind, but also just like, you know, the world that you could be living in instead. It's just like the same. There's no separation, you know, it's the same kind of like red the entire time. And you've kind of like gone past the border or the barrier or whatever. And just kind of ended up in the same world. And, you know, I guess having said that, like your last record was also transfixed on a struggle of some sort, you know, against depression, against like, you know, racism and so on and so forth. Like when did this struggle, you know, against like an unknowable, unseeable God character become like the focus instead?
I think well the main inspirations when we last spoke about Smiling with No Teeth, I think I told you the main inspirations were like Prince and Talking Heads.
Sure.
And with this album, the main inspirations were all literary. It was all it was Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, which is a play. It was Franz Kafka Metamorphosis,
right?
And it was a manga called Berserk by Kentaro Miura.
I know the first two get overtly referenced in the lyrics. Does the last one? Does the last one as well?
Well, the last one is actually where the album title comes from.
Oh, okay.
The main character from that manga has a nickname, and he's the Struggler.
Got it.
So yeah, they all have pretty overt references. But I think they all kind of, especially the first two, they are, I would deem them like absurdist literature and absurdist theater. And I think thematically, I felt like they played into what I was feeling and what I felt other people were feeling in the world around us. Like, for example, the first few passages of Metamorphosis, you know, the main character gets turned into this huge vermin, this huge bug. And like the first thing he thinks isn't like, oh shit, why am I this huge bug? It's like, oh shit, what's my boss going to think? Like, how am I going to get to work? I'm going to be late because like I can't move with these little like bug legs. And I just thought that was like so hilariously on point with kind of how it feels like we've been living as a whole in the absurdity of the world today, like through COVID, through you know, the bushfires that we hear in Australia, through these wars that we can see on TikTok, like live streamed wars. It's all very absurd and kind of dystopian, but yet still every day we're able to like just get up and, you know, kind of brush it off in a sense and keep it moving and move on to tomorrow. And I think that was a very I think that's a very underappreciated trait of humans, just the stubbornness of our will to survive and persevere. And I think all of those three references kind of displayed this theme in a very absurd and strange and weird way. And I kind of wanted to make somewhat of like a partner piece in a musical sense to that, because all of those are literary. So I wanted to make like a kind of musical peer to that, I guess.
Mm. I mean, those are the literary places that you're pulling from. Like, I mean, you know, secondarily, what were some of the musical influences that you might have had going into this record? Because it's definitely a different vibe than your last album. And, you know, in some ways, I would say it's kind of slightly more focused in terms of, you know, like a lot of the percussion and guitar tones and kind of bass tones that you used, and also kind of the vocal delivery that you're approaching, you know, this big bellowing vocal delivery that you're hitting a lot of tracks with. Like, you know, was there anything that made you feel like that you needed to kind of maybe like narrow things in a little bit more for this record to get it to, you know, sort of like bring a certain sound to the table more consistently?
Okay, with the influences question, I won't say there wasn't musical influences, because there's always going to be. Right. But honestly, I between finishing Smiling with No Teeth to finishing Struggler, I listened to the least amount of music I'd ever listened to in my life. And I don't really know why, but it just wasn't hitting me the same as it did before, which was why these literary influences came into mind. But, you know, when I was listening to music, I was listening to Idols. I listened to some, what's his name? It's like this, I think he's German, like German industrial artist from the 80s, like Nitzer Ebb or something like that. But yeah, I wasn't listening to that much music. When it came to focusing stuff down, that's always been something that I had in mind to do for future projects. I think when I was making Smiling with No Teeth, it was like there are a lot of reasons that Smiling with No Teeth sounds the way it sounds, but a lot of it was born out of frustration, honestly. Before Smiling with No Teeth, I wasn't a big artist, but you know, people knew who I was in Australia, and I kind of had, I think, just the process of releasing music before I started making albums was just so slow, and I was making these batches of songs, but I could release a single, you know, once every, you know, few months, just for the purposes of like, this song has to get played this much on radio before they'll play a new song, or like we have to think about playlisting and stuff like that. And just like working my way around these industry systems became quite a slow process. So I was making songs. I would make like 20 songs, and they'd span funk and rap and punk and folk music. But because the process was so slow, I'd only get through those first 3 songs. So there was like there became this notion that Genesis Owusu is like the funk guy, or like the funk pop guy.
Right.
And I hated that. It got to a point where like I hated seeing the word funk next to my name. I was like, shut up. So Smiling with No Teeth was almost born out of frustration, in a sense, whereas like, okay, yes, I am the funk guy, but I'm also the punk guy. I'm also the rap guy. I can also be the electronic folk guy. I can be whatever guy that you think I am and that I think I am. And like the boundary is only the boundary of your imagination. And I always thought that was the right way to come out of the gate, so that in future, we already know this guy can do it all. And now he's just going to focus on, maybe this album will be the punk album. Maybe this album will be the electronic album. You know, I've already set the statement, and now I'm just like free to make the more focused projects, which is yeah, my first foray into that with Struggler, I guess.
It's funny that you sort of have that disdain for that label. You were talking about sort of like making hits earlier, and I don't know. At least to my weird ass ears, I'm like, I feel like there's a few songs that have like hit vibes, maybe tied up, and that's maybe like the closest song to that vibe. And if that song were to pop off, that would just like reinforce even more those presumptions. But I
Hey
mean,
man, if it's a hit, I won't mind wearing the Funk Guy label a bit longer.
well, I mean, when it comes to, from your perspective now, when it comes to like, the idea of making hits, do you feel like, from seeing a little bit more about how the sausage is made from your position, like, do you feel like that comes down more to, as you were kind of referring to earlier, like working through those industry systems in the certain way that you have to get, the song in the right place at the right time? Or do you feel like it has more to like, oh, we need to engineer it in a certain way and have like a certain kind of production and a certain kind of vocal on it and a certain kind of whatever on it?
I think where I am right now, which is surely bound to change as I get more experience, but I think right now the actual music seems to have like 15% impact on whether the song is a hit or not. It seems to have to go through so many other criteria that has almost nothing to do with the music, it seems to me, to become a hit. So now, like, the thought of trying to make a hit kind of feels like a dog chasing its own tail, in a sense. Kind of feels like this thing that shouldn't really be chased, and if it happens, it happens. Because at least from like a musical perspective, I don't think from my level a hit can necessarily be engineered. Like maybe if you're like a huge label and you've like developed this artist and put them in the exact right places and you control those systems to an extent, then maybe you can like engineer a hit. But even with that, like people see artists that they claim are like industry plants, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter unless people like it or not. Yeah, even if you have all the right ingredients, seemingly, it still will never 100% be guaranteed that it's a hit or not. So It kind of feels like trying to catch a butterfly or something, and it just like is always slightly out of your grasp. So I think that's another a lesson that I learned making this album, which is probably another reason why it turned into an existential crisis of an album of a roach trying to run away from God.
Getting a little bit into that crisis and the narrative of the record, I wanted to ask you about a few tracks here, specifically one of them being Old Man. What made you lyrically want to kind of frame God in that way and give God that kind of like characteristic of, that, I mean, I think your average person probably would presume God to kind of be in that frame, in terms of like that demographic. But like, is there anything beyond that sort of made you want to portray him that way, specifically given that, you titled the song, in that fashion?
I think, for me, trying to talk about all of these different things, whether it's destiny, luck, COVID, bureaucracy, capitalism, just all of these grand and looming uncontrollable or controllable things that might be controllable but seem uncontrollable, whether they're forces of the universe or man-made, trying to sum all these things up into a single easy to understand character. It just seemed like God. Like God was, this 3-letter word that seems to be powerful enough as a symbol to actually encapsulate all of these things. I think just from a writing perspective as well, um, obviously you can put religion into those frameworks as well, but it's not necessarily like it's not a critique or a criticism of religion. Me personally, I come from a religious household. My mom took me to church for like the first 18 years of my life. She was the leader of her church's gospel choir. I knew like kind of early on that it wasn't necessarily for me on a faith level, but I was like, I was really into the music. And in school, English was my favorite subject. I loved writing stories. So even though I didn't necessarily believe in it, I really liked the characters and the stories and the symbols. And, being in that environment from such a young age, it really became kind of the foundation for like my literary interests. And throughout my musical career or musical experience, I found myself using those same characters and symbols in my own way, just to represent certain themes and things like that. Just because I feel like they're pretty cool and impactful.
And so what kind of character archetypes do you feel like you're pulling from when you talk instead about a track like Freak Boy? Because that track almost sort of seems to be like a kind of a cautionary recommendation where the protagonist is like maybe trying to find meaning in their own life. And also, the funny way that you put it, like, I know you want to be freaky or a freak, but you have to keep it in your pants and so on and so forth. Like it's almost like a warning to the listener to maybe stay within certain boundaries of life or expectations or something in order to maybe get to a destination, or I don't know what, like, prevent things from getting worse.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like the character archetype was just me. I feel like a lot of this album, and the I feel like this album isn't necessarily like a story where you get a start and an end. It's more kind of like the story has already begun and you kind of just get like a chunk from the middle. And I feel like a lot of it was just inspired by what I was going through at the time, like me figuring out that maybe I can't figure this out, or maybe like, me figuring out that maybe I can't figure this out, and the process of getting to that point, and like figuring out that, I don't have the answers yet, but I've got to find something because I've got to do something more than just kind of wallowing in, my own despair or something like that. And I think that's the point, the narrative point in Freak Boy, where it's like, I don't know what to do or what there is, but it's got to be something better than that. And I just got to keep roaching and keep running, and hopefully some answers will be bestowed upon me. But we get further into the narrative and it pans out how it pans out.
To your point, it's not like the most super clear hitting you over the head kind of story or narrative. But there is like a conclusion to it. When you started to write some of these tracks or sort of conceptualize them, did you already have an idea of where it was going, or was that a realization that you kind of came to as you were going through the process?
Yeah, especially the end was a realization. I knew, not always, but like in the bulk of the recording process, I knew the start and the middle. Like it's a journey. Like essentially the story is just running, just trying to survive and figure it out in real time. And honestly, that's what I was doing during the recording process. Like I was trying to figure out, I was going through essentially this like fucking quarter life crisis in real time. So I didn't have the ending because I didn't know what that looked like yet. But yeah, it was, I was kind of writing the album in real time with the Roach, the experiences of the Roach kind of paralleling my own. And eventually, through looking more into like absurdism and these other philosophies, it got to the point where we get to the, I guess, the quote unquote resolution where you recognize that shit isn't necessarily going to change, um, necessarily going to get better or worse. It just is. And the thing that you can do is understand that and um yeah, live that in its power. um yeah, yeah.
All right. A couple more tracks I want to pick your brain about. Kind of referencing or talking about those more religious and Christian inspirations and some of that background that you talked about earlier. I think that makes it a little clear as to why, we get a track like Balthazar. But still, I mean, you're still talking about a religious tradition that's pretty vast, pretty dense, pretty wide. Like, what about that character made you specifically go to him as far as like, a central point for this album and really like one of the biggest and most explosive tracks on the entire record?
I think Balthazar, I think the literal meaning for Balthazar, oh, I kind of forget it, but it had something to do with protect the king or something like that. I think that's what the literal meaning for Balthazar was. Um, so that moment on the album was kind of the rebellion point, I suppose. It was like the grandeur of life is so vast, and maybe like I won't find the answers by running on the track that has been set already. Um, you know, I'm trying to remember the lyrics. I won't wait my turn. The way I live is the way I burn. What's the point when we all end up in the urn? Shit, the point's whatever I discern. It's like, yeah, it's like this point of rebellion where you try and bring the power back into your own hands. It's it comes from my foray through like existentialism, which was an throughout the album. You kind of get these 3 points in regards to philosophy. You get this the point of nihilism, the point of existentialism, and the point of absurdism. And existentialism is kind of the reaction where you're like, okay, maybe there's no inherent point, but maybe that means I can make a point for myself. I can create something for myself. And I guess that is like the rebellious aspect of it. It's kind of like, this life is not giving me any answers, so I'll make an answer for my own. I'll make a reality of my own. And I think that needs to be an explosive point musically, because it's a big punch out of the shell that has like closed in on the character up until that point where they feel like they need to live by certain rules or run a certain track to get the answers that they desire. They're like, no, fuck that. I'm just going to try and make life my own. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think that brings up a lot of interesting stuff to dig further into for the last question or the last track that I wanted to point to. And we go from this explosive track to really the quietest and loosest track on the record. And that would have to be, Stuck to the Fan. Which I think like the point you're trying to make with that track is fairly obvious in terms of like, shit happens essentially. And, you just have to kind of like go along with it or just like move through it, just like anything else. But what made you take the musical direction that you did on that track? Because obviously, you could have come through with another song that sounds like any other song on the record, given how consistent it was from front to back. But on this one, you decided to, like, rather than the sequence drums and the big guitars and the big bass and, like the doubled up vocals, like you did it really raw, you did it really loose. It just felt like, very kind of like woozy studio performance, and the bass and the keys were just kind of like, wandering through the track, and it seemed like, you know, you were just kind of like vocalizing over it in a very like nonchalant way a lot of the time. And also conversely, you know, you're talking about like that fight and that rebellion on the Balthazar track. By contrast, this song very much sort of seems to be like, you know, I'm just going to go along with whatever's happening here, you know? You know, what sort of like made you again, take things musically in that direction as opposed to really any other kind of genre or vibe or anything, you know, for that closing moment to really kind of like bring a lot of the themes of the album home?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just felt real. I think, you know, in our last conversation, when I think we kind of had touched on a similar thing when we were talking about the ending of Smiling with No Teeth with Bye Bye instead of No Looking Back. And I was talking about how No Looking Back kind of felt like it was too Hollywood to be an ending. It kind of wrapped up too nicely and it didn't represent the reality of how things really were. I kind of felt a similar tone to the ending of this album, where it feels like a real-time meditation of the journey so far. I feel like the ending of the song before, which is What Comes Will Come, is kind of grander, and it's like it's once again kind of, it feels like it could be more of that kind of Hollywood resolution, at least musically, like it peaks at this, it plateaus. But at the end of the day, you know, that peak is just one peak in a series of continual peaks and valleys. And I think, yeah, musically speaking, Stuck to the Fan is kind of just, I think it really is just, it felt like a meditation of the journey thus far, and it's not tight and you know, sequenced and you know, procured to that extent, because it's not really an ending. Like, it has to stay loose because there has to be something to continue from. It's always going to be a continuation. There's always going to be more of the peaks and valleys. So it just, it felt right musically in that sense.
And I guess one, you know, and again, I love top to bottom, you know, everything about the track from the message to the lyrics. But like one thing stuck out to me about the messaging in the song that I wanted to ask you about, and that's that lyric about, you know, you taking me right back. Like, what do you feel like you're going back to on the song? What is taking you right back on the track after this journey and after this series of realizations?
I think I'm being taken back to the bullshit, but from a new perspective. It's like, this is like, this is complete fuckery. I've seen this before. I recognize this. This is a place that I know. This is shit stuck to the fan. So, you know, but I've seen it before. I've experienced this before. It's not new or shocking to me now. This is kind of just how things are. But I can understand that better now. You know, like, there's, going back to like that Hollywood ending type of thing. It's like, I feel like at the end of a movie, after the trials and tribulations, you expect there to be like a field of flowers for you to frolic in after you've climbed the huge mountain. But in reality, there's just, a lot of the time, there's just going to be another huge mountain waiting for you to climb. But, you know, you've climbed mountains before, and the more mountains you climb, the better you're just going to become a better climber. So you're taking me back to that's it. You're taking me back to the bullshit, but I've climbed it before, and I can do it better now. I can do it faster, and on to the next.
Dude, I appreciate you coming through and being an open book and sharing everything that you have about the record. Is there anything that you have else, you know, coming down the pipe as far as promo for the album, tour dates, anything that you want to tell us about that we need to kind of keep an eye out open for?
Yes, I'm on tour in the US in like a few weeks.
Hell yeah!
In like 5 days.
You're going to be on the East Coast, I think, in like October.
Yeah. October, November in the US, little EU run in November as well, and Australia in December. So all of that is on my socials, Genesis Owusu, on my website, genesisowusu.com/tour. Hope to see you all there because the show is going to be crazy. It's going to be theatrical. It's going to be chaotic, fire, brimstone, the end of the world and the beginning of a new world. So hope to see you there.
That's an excellent fucking tease.
Thank you.
All right, man. Thanks again for coming through, and I'll talk to you later.
All right. Appreciate it, man.
All right.
Peace.
Bye.